Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode number 50 of Office Hours. 140 some questions later, here we are, 50 episodes in. Thank you so much for coming, and welcome to the office. This is Office Hours. I'm Adam Coble. Today I'm going to be answering 3 of your questions about tabletop RPG game mastering, as I have done for these many weeks. You can get involved in Office Hours if you have burning questions about wheels or otherwise. You can get involved in the show by going to www.adam-coble.com/office-hours, filling out the form, submitting your question, and then waiting patiently for your turn in the initiative order to come up. Today's questions come to you direct from the internet and begin with a little bit of poetry.
Hi, Adam. So with the amount of time I've put into my homebrew world, I'm overly excited to see my players living in the culture and lore I've created. I'm having trouble sparking their curiosity and asking the interesting questions, how and why, instead of the typical, what's the objective and what's the reward. Ultimately, when I drop a tidbit of history or lore of the world, it's become quite clear my players are hearing me but not truly listening, if that makes any sense. So I'd love to know if there's anything I could or should be doing to encourage my players to really embrace my fantasy world. Love the beard, and thanks for your time.
I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive. Stamped on these lifeless things the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed, and on the dungeon master's guide these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck. Boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." So often, we as game masters are Ozymandias, aren't we? We build these worlds so full of light and life and energy, with monsters and weather patterns and complex magic systems, deep and full of nuance. We create systems of government. We write atlases of lore and detail that our players will never even begin to scratch the surface of. We're each of us Tolkien, Rothfuss, a Herbert. Only we've an audience of 4 or 5 or more, I suppose, if we're lucky like me and have an actual audience. But in the end, it's all, look on my works, you fucking idiots, pay attention, and despair. Or like, look at this dungeon, why don't you care about anything more than your next perception check, you jackasses? It's not, look on my works, ye mighty, but please stop arguing over whether you get an extra attack and notice the deep, beautiful themes that permeate the creation I made for you, you ingrates. Only they're not doing it wrong, my friend. You are. Because, like in Shelley's poem, the problem is not the sculptor. The problem is not ye mighty who have forgotten King Ozymandias. The problem is Ozymandias in the first place. World building and creativity, the art of crafting a beautiful backdrop for your players to strut and fret their hour upon the stage, is borderline irrelevant outside the constraints of the rules of the game you're playing. At best, the world building that we do as the game master gives context to the buffoonery of our players' characters. We're not master artisans here. We're just architects of lone and level sands. The things that we make without our players signify nothing. When a game master comes to me to ask how best to draw the attention of their players to the things that they've created, I can't help but bemoan that ache they feel. The idea that we have made something special for our players. Note the way that this was phrased, right? Look there at the question. Uncanny Lantern is saying, embrace and explore the world I have made for them. Like a sad and solitary deity, alone in heaven, we look down at humanity floundering about on Earth, and we think, I made these beautiful mountains for you. Motherfuckers, climb them. I made these beautiful azure seas. Plumb them, please. We just want our creations as world builders to be noticed and attended to, right? Only it's not Senpai that is doing the noticing here. Senpai wants to be noticed too. It feels like buying or making a beautiful birthday card to celebrate someone's existence, which immediately is discarded in favor of the shiny $100 bill inside. Because the sentiment here, the card, means nothing outside the reward that is buried within it. Which isn't to say your players don't appreciate the sentiment of you giving them this world to flop around in, nor that sentiment in the form of world building, right, care and attention to your world won't go unnoticed at all. It's just that the idea of exploring in most games is just not a function of play. There's no reason, mechanically, I mean, for your players to go looking for the next cool thing to absorb, eyes wide like they've just uncovered some long-lost George R.R. Martin live journal post from 1999. The thing about world building is that without the players and their characters' actions to give it context, your world building is a fundamentally masturbatory experience, right? Now, there's nothing wrong with wanting to be appreciated for masturbating skillfully, but let's not kid ourselves about what's happening here. Your responsibility as creator of a world in which the adventure and excitement of a role-playing campaign is to take place, is to give your players a stage upon which to deliver their dramaturgy. Nothing else. In no way are you going to be intrinsically rewarded for crafting a functional and believable setting. Your world building is as perfunctory to the game in many ways, more so even, than the role-playing of your players. Chances are good that if you're not playing Dungeons & Dragons, the game that you're playing cares little, if at all, about your role in the world-building process. GMs are not rewarded for play. Almost everything that we get out of a game is external. GMs don't gain experience points. We don't gain treasure. What we get is this thing that you, Uncanny Lantern, are so desperate for. That thing that you hunger for. We get this extrinsic reward of our players just having a good time and giving a fuck about what we've made. But the thing is, when it comes down to role-playing games, particularly role-playing games as a product, your world building may in fact be getting in the way of the commercial success of the game you're playing. If you create your own world, then who will buy Greyhawk supplements? After all. I suppose what I'm saying, in a sort of bleak, desert blasted way, is that if you're going to spend a bunch of time jerking around building detailed world stuff, you have to get over the idea that your players may never be incentivized to give a shit. Do not build a homebrew world for them. Build for you, Ozymandias. Do not expect ye mighty to despair. They may not even notice. But you know why the world works the way that it does. And if you're lucky, they'll listen when you tell them that the Order of Azure Skies maintains a Griffin cavalry, and they'll work that into their background. Or they'll hear you when you tell them that the Season of Fire is coming. This is active listening, that reincorporation. It's a function of good conversational style, a fundamental aspect, I think, of good role-playing. But the game will not help you there. The game will distract your players from that because your players are there to pursue the two things they have most closely at hand: their rule books and the reward structure therein. So if you've got a world and all that matters to you, or something that matters to you even, doesn't even have to be your primary goal, is that you want to show that world to your players, you have to pick a game that will support your exhibitionism or else hack what you're playing to do so. For example, in award-winning tabletop role-playing game, The Burning Wheel, gotcha, the life paths built in to character creation and their subsequent use in the circles mechanism enforce the setting into play. If a player chooses to be an ateliator, no one can but embrace their love of crossbows because it's a part of the rules of the game. Unless you as a group have chosen to excise affiliation from your game. So what I'm saying here is give your detailed world a reason to matter. Without mechanisms to tie it to the fiction, your world is merely fluff to be inhaled by accident and sneezed out into the trash. Create design content for your game that makes that shit matter, right? If you care about the great civil war between the 12 species of merfolk, make your players play merfolk in the game to internalize that fact, that civil war is part of their play. Give them new class options, new spells, new items, contextualize, because without mechanisms, the details of your world have no teeth. And without teeth, you can't hope to make a lasting impression on your players. Such is the downfall of 1,000 beautiful settings and the rise of the myth of the game master come failed author, right? There's this lore, this idea, this trope in tabletop role-playing games that every game master is really just a thwarted author. Someone who would, if they were more driven or more creative or better or less reliant on other players, they would be an author. They would be a Herbert. They'd be a Tolkien. But fuck that, right? What we do as game masters is, in a way, better than what Tolkien hoped to achieve, than what Herbert could have done. Because we create something with other people. We embrace other people's ideas. We can create a thing. We're more like a rock band than we are like failed authors, which I think is cooler. I mean, unless your rock band was like a bunch of fantasy authors. It's a fundamentally different thing. They're not the same protocols or behaviors, and do not approach game mastering like you would authoring. Do not do it. We want to create an environment rife with opportunity for adventure and excitement. And we want to set that stage as best as we can. If we don't connect our world to the game itself and thereby to the fiction, we are failing. There has to be a mechanism attached to the fluff to make it worth a damn unless your players are already acting in a way that incorporates your whole world. But they're not, because you're here asking me this question, how to make them do that. Mechanisms are how. One thing that I've found useful is modulating the reward structure of your game. If you want to lure your players into learning about the world you've created, give them a mechanism to engage with it. It might be an XP reward for learning new things, geography, history, arcane details about the world. It might also be mechanizing the interaction between player and setting. For example, if you want to incorporate Apocalypse World style interrogative moves, look at the supplement for Lamentations of the Flame Princess by Vincent Baker called The Seclusium of Orphone of the Three Visions. It's OSR D&D with a bunch of Apocalypse World sensibilities. You want to give your players a reason via their characters to care about and ask you things about your world. Then you can giddily answer without being that asshole who stops play for a half an hour to talk about lemon tarts. Speaking of which.
Hello, Adam. I'm currently designing towns for my campaign, which is a 5e D&D. But that's not really what I wanted to ask you about. What I wanted to ask you about was I'm trying to make these towns as culturally distinctive as possible. And one of the ways that I thought to do this was food. Describe the kind of foods that the party encounters when going town to town. I was wondering if there was any other ideas that you had to make each town distinct from another, so they're not just walking through a gray slate.
So I'm all in favor of the little stuff. So often we try and give life to our settings with these big, broad, epic strokes, right? We come from a tradition of world creation and world engagement that is writ large, sweeping mountain ranges, wide jungle valleys. We give our players the histories of grand wars and the long storied tales of the people who took part in them, right? We tell tales of Celebrimbor and Sauron. And that's all great. It's all well and good, this big stuff, but you can't use it in play, can you? War, for example, as backdrop is all well and good, but in the moment, as the players navigate the landscape, war is this big messy blur of concepts that in the moment doesn't matter. War is irrelevant. Being stabbed in the kidneys by someone who doesn't speak the same language as you, that matters. So you, like George R.R. Martin, have hit upon something that I think is actually really important. As in a relationship, in role-playing games, it's the little stuff that counts. In the end, when we take time to look back at our lives, fictional or otherwise, we don't remember the big, broad stuff. We remember little details that stuck in the warp and weft of our lives' tapestries. We might not remember the family trip to Disneyland, but we might instead remember how we went on Space Mountain 3 times in a row because the dark and the speed of it was exhilarating. And as children, we always loved space. In the same way, we might not have a lot of success in our games painting the settings in these big, dramatic strokes. For example, so real-world example here, I can say to you that the Court of Swords is home to a people who are fierce and competitive, with no fear and a desire to speak their minds. But that won't matter as much as your memories of Twee, the little girl bent on protecting her brother in the face of abject horror. This, I think, in a way, it ties into the show, don't tell approach to game mastery, and that we can explain in a sort of overarching way that the people of a certain land have a particular outcome or belief in their lives. We can show you the little details of what they're like, and you're going to learn by example, right? I'm so fully in favor of this detail-oriented approach to world expression. It feels intimate and poignant and contradictory in places. And it's fun. It's fun to do that. So how do we make these little things come to life? How do we change the world into a series of distinct and interesting things? First, we have to, as people, have a breadth of experience that can allow us to draw on the details of our own life, real or otherwise. You cannot hope but to describe a thing until you've seen it or imagined it yourself. Your imagination is bounded by the things that you can imagine, if that makes sense. It's a truism, I know. But for example, so a real world example, if you watched the Tokyo arc of Mirror Shades, which is to say, our game of Shadowrun on roleplay with Dodger, Caitlin, Wheat, and JP, you will have seen a window into time that I spent in Japan. Every location that I described in that arc, from the karaoke bar to the house in Ikebukuro, came from a fictionalized version of a real place I had in my head to draw on. So when I was describing the hallway leading up to the karaoke room in which the players were going to hang out, I was describing a real place that I had been in my life. Now, it doesn't have to be, for you, a place you've been before or a food you've eaten before, but like, watch shows about food, right? Read books. Care about these things in the world and then fictionalize them. Because, you know, we can't all take a trip to darkest Faerun, but we can experience things, right? Culture, cuisine, nature, art, architecture that will inform us either directly through our own experience or indirectly through the real or fictionalized experiences of others. I say this a lot on the show, but like, have a life, right? I'm not saying you don't have one, but like, enjoy your life, have hobbies, travel, experience the world around you, or at least expose yourself to art and culture that you wouldn't otherwise, because all of that stuff will inform what you bring to the table. It's infinitely easier to describe the behaviors of an NPC suffering from a broken heart after having had one yourself. And while it can be difficult to experience all the things you imagine your character is experiencing, everybody in the room who's been stabbed with a broadsword, raise your hand. Even a parallel or similar experience can help. This is the flip side of turning everything into an opportunity to incorporate into Dungeons & Dragons. I watched, insert the name of any movie here, and I saw something that I could bring into my games. I was thinking about this when I was talking with JP about The Revenant. The Revenant is a survival film starring Leonardo DiCaprio, set in ye old frontiersy times. And in it, our boy, Leo, is mauled horrifically by a bear. Watching that scene, below my feelings of, oh God, this is horrible, were, I guess this is what it would be like to be attacked by a manticore. Watch things, listen to things, embrace what you learn from them, bring them into your game. To give you some more concrete advice, what I would do when creating a new culture or place in my campaign setting is think about where the truths of that place and that culture lie, and where those truths come from. I like to think about the now of a place. What is a snapshot of life in that space like? Are the people fat and happy? Are they worried about their neighbors invading their lands? Do they have old grudges? Is there new strife in their world? What gives them hope? We can think about big shit like religion or whatever, but religious dogma isn't a thing until it's contextualized by human behavior. Something that always stuck with me about Dogs in the Vineyard, for example, which describes to us a fictional Wild West where Mormonism is a core discipline of the day, how there are all these fucking rules about how people supposedly behave. But even though a bare elbow on a woman is taboo, when it is time for her to do work, she rolls up her sleeves. You see what I'm saying? The interesting bits about a society or a people are not in their broad rules. They're in the ways that the dogma is trumped by other stuff. Family, practicality, necessity, reality. So when you're thinking about describing that delicious feast, think about what you're actually telling your players and if they'll have context for that information. Before you show them the stuffed goose on the table, find a way to illustrate the goose in context. Is it a rare delicacy? Does it have spiritual significance? Or is it just another pest with feathers killed because it happens to be around and eaten because that's what's available? Everything we tell our players as the game master has meaning. Some meanings are big, some are small, and it's not up to us to decide which is which. We simply paint with the brushes of illumination and tell the story of a world that feels real first and foremost. Like, there's a reason that Sansa Stark loves lemon tarts, right? Sansa loves lemon tarts because they represent a person she wants to be. You can't get lemons in Winterfell, motherfucker. You have to go to King's Landing for that shit. And everyone in King's Landing is rich and wears pretty dresses and might yet marry a king, right? The idea here is that food in your setting is there, like NPCs, like local plant life, like war and religion, like behavior, to illustrate something about the world. Give your players the details that matter to you, that illustrate and tell the story of the world you care about. It's not your job to give them useful or meaningful information. If you have a group who thinks that everything that you say is a clue or a hint, right? If you mention to your players that they are serving rhubarb pie, and you have the kind of group that thinks, rhubarbs, eh? Well, that's important. Dungeons and Dragons says that everything the GM tells me is important. We're going to go looking into rhubarbs. You need to let that group know, hey, I'm just trying to paint a picture for you, right? This is a bit the inverse of the last question, in that you have to be satisfied with rhubarb pie just being a pie. Your players may not ever notice this, but it's giving you context to create flavor here, literal and metaphoric. Paint the picture your heart sees when you imagine that warm tavern hall, winds whipping cold outside. Show them the hearth. Give them the smell of cinnamon and apple in the air. Tell them about the red cheeks of the reindeer herdsfolk returning from the hills. Follow your passion, right? Follow what you love about the setting and use that to bait the hook, so that when your players hear you go on and on about the fucking tarts, they know it's because the tarts are symbolic of or meaningful of something bigger. Thing is, if you aren't playing the right game or your players just want to murder fuck their way from one town to another, you're wasting your breath. Painting targets in beautiful colors just means more mess to clean up. Don't waste your time and energy on stuff the players and the game just don't care about. Conversely, and perhaps the most important thing, is to play with people who care about similar things as you. And you can learn this just from watching what your players do when you describe things to them. Right? If a player gets really excited about the stew in a particular tavern, that means they cared enough to listen when you described that stew the first time. And they've made an in-character decision to return to that inn for that stew. That's a win. You won. Congratulations. So keep doing that. Do that with players who are going to respect and appreciate it.
Hi Adam, I'm Brian, or Vice Versa 951 on Twitch. I run a 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons game, and one of my players tends to get a little lost and confused during combat. Their turns drag on, and I do my best to offer them advice on what's effective or what their options are, always telling them the consequences and asking what they do. But their turns still end up feeling like they're what I would do in that given situation. Like, if I were playing a character, what the most optimal move would have been is just what I suggest. And more or less, after I tell them the consequences of the alternative actions, that's usually what they end up going with. So, my question is, how do I draw the line between offering helpful advice as a GM and literally playing their character for them? Thank you for your time.
So, players are players, and GMs are GMs. And generally speaking, we have our own responsibilities and jobs to do in a game. You, as the game master, might know all the rules for the sake of completeness, because often you're the one with the books, and you want to understand the things that a player might do so you can understand their options as you do your job around them. Your job is to learn the rules of the game and apply them to the play as you go. Their job is to do the same. Learn the rules of the game and apply them to the parts of play that they are engaging with as they move through the world that you build. Now, part of learning is doing, and part of doing is failure. Our job as game master is not inherently to teach the rules of the game to our players. Now, I don't know, maybe that's revolutionary. So let's take a second to I'm going to say that again, and let's let that sink in. Your job as the game master is not to teach the rules of the game to your players. At least I can't think of a game where that's the instructed task of the game master. Players are responsible for their own learning. So when it comes down to it, at least theoretically, I think that we ought, as game masters, not to give advice on player action at all. So I guess the answer here is stop, right? Don't do it. Though when your player looks at you with big, nervous, puppy dog eyes, not knowing whether to cast Scorching Ray or Magic Missile, it can be incredibly hard not to remind them that, yes, the chances of their actually hitting with Scorching Ray are very, very low. I think this is where, like in so many elements of the game, that social responsibility thing comes into play. That assumption that the GM isn't just another player, but teacher and mentor and protector as well. We should be learning how to play properly from the rules of the game, not from the person who is playing our adversary. It's just not a sound model. Because, as you mentioned, you're undermining their agency by providing them with your opinions of optimal choice. In a way, showing them the best possible suggestion is taking away their ability to learn by failure. So in a group where everyone is new to the game, you can be a little gentle. You can turn down the overall difficulty and then just let them fail. In this case, I don't mean let them get the rules wrong, or don't offer to suggest a breadth of options. Consider, if you will, the differences between these two things, you might say to a player. On your turn, you can take an action, you can move your movement rate, and then you might have something you can do as a bonus action. Take a look at your character sheet. In this case, you might move over to that orc and make an attack with your sword. Be careful, though. Once you're standing that close, it'll be a risk to get away if you change your mind, because the orc can make an attack of opportunity. Or you should probably move next to the orc that Throndir is fighting and then make an attack with your rapier, because then you get to make your sneak attack and deal extra damage. If you kill the orc that way, you can finish your move and end up by the door so that on the next turn you can pick the lock. One of these things is simply restating a thing that a player ought to know. It's a fine suggestion. You're just regurgitating the rulebook to them. The other is very literally playing their character for them, and even if they wanted to do something different, it's very hard to make that call when the GM has just given you what they would do. This assumes that all your players are of a similar skill level, which is to say, not particularly good at the game yet. So in that case, and I know that isn't the case with you, I know you have one particular player, but if you are playing with all people of a similar skill level, it's fine just to let them make the decisions they want to, help them remember the rules, and let them fuck up when they fuck up. If you find yourself cringing your way through the game, wanting desperately to adjust their behavior to a more optimal model, check yourself, because that is a bad urge. Watch for them learning how the rules work. Let them make mistakes until they learn not to, and be proud when they figure out the puzzle that is the game that you're playing. Don't ruin that for them by stepping in with advice, however friendly. A good rule of thumb might be using "you could" rather than "you should" statements. Give them an idea of their mechanical options in a broad way if they're forgetting them, but never give tactical or strategic advice, if you can. Because making sound tactical decisions is their job, not yours. Now, if you're lucky, you have one or more other players in your game who are already more studied and practiced at the game you're playing together. People who can, when it comes down to it, offer that kind of advice. Now, compare and contrast what I'm about to say with an earlier episode where we talked about having someone in the game who is the pro. Because you can go too far with this. But the thing is, in Dungeons & Dragons particularly, players are often operating as a team. Getting advice from your teammates is a whole other thing than getting advice from what amounts to the opposing team. Again, back on that weird social level, though, you have to all be on the lookout for the kind of advice they're giving. If Dave is particularly good at Dungeons & Dragons, it's going to be part of Dave's responsibility not to play other people's characters for them more optimally than they are playing. And if your Dave is as good as my Dave, they'll know this and bite their tongue when someone makes a suboptimal choice. And you'll get to laugh a little bit as you watch them squirm. Talk about this inexperience as a group. Don't treat this new player like an experiment or like their inexperience is a problem to be solved. Ask them how much advice they'd like from their fellow players and help them learn the way that the game's myriad options make sense to them. My suggestion here is just back the fuck up. Right? You can clarify and explain rules, but advice from the GM is a dangerous thing that tends to violate the tenets of your job and theirs. There is a situation in which I was given some advice about whether to engage in combat as a PC. I was told, "You're worrying too much about how dangerous this monster is. You can take it. Just go fight it." To which my reply was, "No, don't tell me that. Don't violate that layer for me. I'm being cautious because my character would be. Don't tell me what you think of an encounter, because now, if I dive in and I get killed, I'm going to blame you, and you're going to blame me for listening to you, and we're not going to feel good about that. If you as the GM say, no, this is a fine risk, go ahead and take that risk, and the players all die, they are going to blame the GM for ever having said anything. Your neutrality on matters of strategic decisions is paramount. So if your player needs to brush up on the rules or is slowing the game down with their inexperience, they need not to look to you to fix it, but read the fucking book and catch up with the rest of the class. If they are having trouble doing that, they need to get a tutor. Find someone in the group they can attach to who will teach them how to be a better cleric or wizard or multi-class cleric, wizard, thief. There is nothing wrong with clarification in the moment. Hey, does anyone remember what stat this uses again? How much damage is a longsword? But stick to that and avoid answering questions about what they ought to be doing. Might be a bit more uncomfortable, but they're going to appreciate it as they learn on their own. And answering this question, I can think of a half dozen times that I've done the exact opposite without thinking during Court of Swords. It's a hard habit to break. I want to see the rules get used in a cool, exciting way. I want to watch my players succeed and learn and do cool shit with their characters. But if we tell them what to do, we create a harsh dichotomy between what the GM says I should do and every other thing in the game. In that situation, the only smart thing to do is whatever the GM just told you to do. And then if it goes badly, it can feel uncomfortable because we need to get away from the idea that the GM is always right about everything forever. And subsequently, the GM needs to not act like they have the best insight into every possible situation. So my suggestion here is draw that line between offering advice and playing their character as conservatively as possible. If a player says to you, "What should I do?" shrug and say, "I don't know or care." Tell them, you're a grown-up. Go ahead and make your own decisions. But let them kibitz amongst themselves. Let them debate what the right thing to do is. But keep an eye out for other players having pandemic syndrome and trying to play other people's characters for them. Don't allow it anywhere in your game. But create an environment in which you can all support and boost each other's knowledge of the rules. So there you go. That's my thoughts on that matter. It is tricky because I always want people to get good at D&D. I want them to learn. I want them to improve, but you got to let them fuck up first. You got to let them fuck up. So that's the thing that you need to work on. They need to learn the goddamn rules. All right? Encourage that as gently as you can. So this has been episode 50 of Office Hours. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. As always, I am Game Master Adam Coble, and you are ostensibly still you. Congratulations. If you want to get involved in Office Hours, if you want to submit some questions, you want to ask those things that are burning a hole in your Game Master brain, just go to my website, www.adam-cole.com/office-hours. Fill out the form, and I will take a look. Don't worry about asking a question that has already been asked. I will do that editing. And sometimes asking a question that's already been asked in a new way is kind of cool for me because I can re-answer a thing 50 plus episodes later in a new way. So don't worry about that. Let me take care of the editing. You take care of asking questions. We'll see you next time, everybody. Thanks for coming.